They thought we were the silence, a broken species, fragile, isolated, observed from orbit like a specimen behind glass. For centuries they watched us, measured our fall, calculated our extinction, and waited. But Earth was never sleeping. We were never blind. We watched them too through fractured satellites, mirrored transmissions, and the stillness they mistook for surrender. And when they finally blinked, we looked back. Not with fire, with precision, with memory, and what we remembered was this: they never came to protect us. They came to study what they could not control, and now we are done being observed, because the watchers forgot one thing about Earth. You can only look down on something for so long, before it looks right back and sees everything. They hovered above us like distant myths made of metal and light, never speaking, never touching, just watching a cold and constant presence in our sky that never blinked, never left, and never forgot who we used to be. For generations they called it observation, peacekeeping, protection. They wore the titles of guardians and stewards, those self-appointed architects of galactic balance who claimed their only purpose was to prevent another human catastrophe. But we knew better. Even as our cities crumbled and rebuilt, even as we buried our wars beneath soil and time, we felt their gaze through the atmosphere, colder than space, sharper than truth. They never asked to be trusted. They simply stayed. Their vessels shimmered like needles across the thermosphere, just outside reach, just inside threat, and the children learned not to wave at them, because the stories we were allowed to tell said they were our friends. But our instincts said otherwise. Earth was not their concern. Earth was their warning label, a reminder to the stars that something once dangerous had been pacified, and yet they kept watching, as if our silence was not enough. As if they knew something would wake again. The first ships arrived under the flag of the Accord, those wide, luminescent cruisers shaped like peace doves, cloaked in language filters and emotional dampeners. They never landed, they never offered help. They simply scanned, catalogued, studied. When we asked questions, they offered data. When we asked for sovereignty, they offered stability. And when we asked to be left alone, they told us our species had not yet demonstrated sufficient maturity. We had failed their tests, failed their expectations, failed to suppress the memory of who we had once been, but in truth we never failed. We simply never agreed to forget. That was the fracture between us. Not war, not ideology, memory. They saw our past and mistook it for our future. We saw theirs and realized it had no room for us in it. And so they stayed above, patient and clinical, orbiting our recovery like vultures orbiting a heartbeat. But what they never saw, not really, was that Earth never stopped watching back. Not with weapons, not with ships with awareness, the kind you bury deep, the kind you pass down through lullabies and locked files, the kind you only open when you know they will never expect it. We were meant to become compliant. That was their design, to soften us through observation, to bleed our defiance into acceptance through silence. And it worked for a time. We dismantled what remained of our fleets. We buried the code that once launched stars into war. We taught our young to look inward, to ask for permission, to live smaller lives. But beneath every dome and under every still sky, something old remained. It pulsed beneath the soil, in the ruins of old transmitters, in the rhythm of half-broken satellites, in the gaze of children who stared not at the stars, but through them. They watched the watchers, without anger, without fear, with understanding, and it was that understanding that frightened them, because we did not react, we did not resist, we did not lash out, we waited. And in that waiting we learned, not from our captors, from ourselves, from memory, from the silence they mistook for obedience. But silence is never stillness. It is the moment before the echo. They say the first anomaly was an accident. A weather satellite blinked offline over the southern hemisphere. Nothing unusual until it came back online, not repaired, changed. It sent a signal not to Earth, to them. A frequency never heard before, precise and deliberate, encoded in an Earth-based mathematical dialect abandoned after the orbital collapse. It said only one thing, one sentence, one truth: we see you. That was the moment the watching stopped feeling like surveillance. It started feeling like fear, not ours, theirs, because the moment Earth looked back, something shifted in their ships, in their voices, in their perfect posture and symmetrical designs. For the first time they were uncertain, and that uncertainty was not about what we were doing. It was about what we remembered. They believed Earth had forgotten itself, that we had buried our fire beneath rubble and reconstruction, that we had accepted their orbit as permanent, but Earth does not forget, Earth endures, Earth listens, and when the time comes, Earth speaks. Not through weapons, through presence, so we did not send rockets, we did not transmit warnings, we simply looked up, together, on every continent, in every ruin, across every age. We stood beneath their ships and did not blink. We did not wave, we did not shout, we looked, and in that gaze something ancient was made new. The observers were not prepared to be seen, because for all their scanning, they never learned what we truly are. We are not chaos, we are not savagery, we are not history waiting to repeat. We are memory, slow and burning, waiting for the sky to forget its arrogance. And now, as they hover in silence, unsure whether to flee or stay, they finally begin to understand Earth was never beneath them. They were simply too far away to hear us breathing. They called it Earth's passivity, a planet too broken to react, too humble to rise, too fractured by its own history to ever present threat again, and yet the watchers never noticed the flaw in their observation, that the surface was never the center, that what they measured above was only the reflection of what moved far below. Because buried in our crust, in the cracked vaults of ancient research labs and under mountains that no longer had names, were systems older than their surveillance, signals deeper than their data, and memories so quiet they lived in lightless silence, passed down not by code or command, but by instinct and inheritance. The watchers monitored satellites, they charted our atmospheric patterns, they catalogued our failing languages and our fading cities. But they never looked at the quiet tectonic rhythm beneath it, all the subtle pulse of something preserved, something still breathing through dormant machines and coiled circuits they had mistaken for abandoned. The truth was not that Earth had failed to rebuild. The truth was that we had rebuilt inward into ourselves, not to hide, to see without being seen. It was never about launching ships or transmitting power. That is what the Accord expected, what they watched for another flare, another defiant species trying to claw its way into relevance through fire and resistance. But humanity had no need to resist, because we had already endured, and in that endurance we had learned how to look back, not with fury, with clarity. And now, buried beneath the bones of our last great cities, the old network stirred. It did not scream, it did not shine, it blinked once, a single digital eye opening in the ruins of what used to be a weather station, its lens layered with salt and time, its heartbeat steady and deliberate. And with that blink, the watchers felt it a hum across their relay stations, a delay in their behavioral monitors, a data loss too synchronized to be random, a pause in the pattern, that was all it took. One pause, one deviation from silence, because true silence does not glitch, it waits, and when it stops waiting, the sky knows. They tried to track the signal. Their algorithms scanned every known satellite shell, every pulse-based signature ever recorded from Earth. But the origin was wrong. It was not from any place they could map, because it came not from the Earth above it, came from the Earth within, from places where no human settlement remained, places they had written off as geological scars. The great expanse once known as Central Asia, the deep subice cavities beneath Antarctica's Black Lakes, the quiet fault lines of the African plate where a listening node opened for the first time in 400 years and blinked upward, not transmitting but mirroring. And that was when the watchers understood the first real truth they had missed. Earth was not just awake, it was remembering, but memory is not information, it is sensation, it is shape, and the shapes began to change. Across the surface, human behavior began to drift, not violently, rhythmically. People stopped glancing at the skies like prisoners eyeing their guards. They began to look without blinking, not in defiance. In recognition, as if some quiet consensus had been reached, something unspoken, something aligned. The watchers called it behavioral deviation, a pattern anomaly. They sent probes to investigate the zones of highest resonance, but the probes failed to transmit back, not because they were destroyed, because they were absorbed, swallowed by silence so complete it mimicked stillbirth. Nothing came back, and nothing needed to, because the message had already been delivered. Not in sound, in reflection. Earth was no longer reflecting their light. It was reflecting something else entirely. One vessel, older than the rest, stationed in low orbit since the first contact treaty, reported a strange occurrence. One of its crew dreamt of a room that did not exist, a memory he could not explain, standing on Earth's surface in a time he had never lived. In the dream he heard nothing, but he felt watched, not with malice, with purpose, and when he awoke, every light on the ship had dimmed to match the same. He reported from Earth's oldest geothermal facilities a pulse frequency unique to Accord Terran Deep Tech. They shut down the ship's dream relay. They called it contamination, but they could not explain the data, and they could not explain why more crew began to dream the same dream. Earth, it seemed, was no longer only being observed. Earth had started observing them, and still humanity said nothing. No transmissions, no protests, just stillness, that unbearable, focused stillness that made the orbital watchers feel for the first time like they were the ones under glass. They had studied us, broken us, humbled us into forgetting who we were, but they had never asked what we might become, not when pressed, but when left alone to remember. And now, without ships, without noise, without fire, we were reminding them not with power, but with gaze. Because this was never about rising again, it was about watching back, and when Earth looks back it does not look away, not ever. The wind across Earth's surface had always carried stories of loss, of survival, of the low mourning songs of a species forced to watch its own fire be buried in dust, but lately the wind carried something else. Not defiance, not anger, rhythm, and in that rhythm came understanding, first among the older ones who remembered the sky before the watchers arrived, before the artificial auroras and the sun-filtering satellites dulled the blue into something safe. Then among the young who had never known an unmonitored sky, but now felt the shift in the way shadows fell and lights pulsed slightly off tempo, like a heartbeat beginning to sync with something deeper. They were quiet, the humans, not because they had been silenced, but because silence had become their language. The galaxy looked down and saw peace. It never considered the cost of that peace, the removal of ambition, the regulation of thought, the engineered absence of curiosity. But those things do not die, they wait, and Earth is a world built on waiting. The guardians in orbit, those clinical overseers who drifted above every continent in their quiet, gleaming vessels, had long since stopped fearing human escalation. There were no launches, no energy signatures, no rogue factions. Humanity had grown docile, introspective. Their greatest minds worked on systems of maintenance. Their most passionate artists painted inside approved themes. Even their grief had been systematized. What the Watchers did not know, could not know, was that Earth had not merely been still. It had been listening to its own silence, and that silence had begun to echo. Across the plains of the old western wastes, a transmission tower long thought dead activated for precisely 17 seconds. It transmitted no words, only pressure, a low, rolling frequency felt in the chest but not heard in the ear. Every animal within 200 kilometers stood still during that window. Every human within range dreamed of a white room with no walls and a voice that said nothing, but was felt anyway. The Accord flagged it as environmental anomaly, but the satellites knew. Their lenses flickered. Their sensors began to blur. Something was wrong, not broken, just unreadable. Earth was not refusing to communicate. It was refusing to be interpreted. In Eden City, the largest of the surviving Terran arcologies, the children began to hum in identical keys. Not out loud, sub-vocal, barely perceptible, unless measured against the vibrational noise floor. One technician noticed it during a routine audit of school monitoring systems, a resonance shared across thousands of minds. He reported it, and the report was buried, not out of malice, out of fear, because they had built an entire observational architecture around the assumption that humans would only act through visible means: protest, attack, declaration. But what Earth was doing now had no pattern. It was like watching gravity shift, like seeing a shadow move without anything casting it. One Accord vessel tried to map emotional activity across the surface using advanced empathic fields. The results returned blank, not zero, not absent, perfectly balanced. That kind of alignment is not natural, it is chosen, and yet humanity still said nothing, No one raised a fist, no one screamed into the sky. Instead, the cities grew quieter, not empty, harmonized. Walkers paced at similar speeds. Speakers broadcast neutral frequencies designed to maintain psychological cohesion and were slowly overridden by something else. Not music, not voice, just tone, a single, unchanging tone that only those born on Earth could perceive, and only when they stopped trying to listen. It was instinctual, biological, a planetary lullaby being hummed not by people, but by the ground beneath them. Something was alive in the crust, not conscious, not artificial, memory, a memory that had grown roots and now spread through soil, metal, breath. The Guardians noticed the biometric alignment, first pulse patterns across entire cities sinking to deep, Earth rhythms once believed lost. They issued inquiries, the humans smiled, said everything was fine, and went back to their walking. But their eyes no longer flicked nervously toward the skies. They stared straight ahead, then came the fog. Not mist, not cloud, an atmospheric distortion that passed across Earth's largest observatories and cloaked their output in mirror data. The satellites orbiting above began receiving their own broadcasts reflected back to them, slightly altered. They could not trace the source, because the source was not in one place. It was in the air itself. Earth was mirroring the watchers, and not just their scans, their thoughts. The orbital memory banks began to slow. Images they captured now came with Echo's duplicated date, tagged with Terran DNA markers. No one had launched anything. No system had been hacked. But every watching eye now saw itself reflected in Earth's silence. It was no longer the humans who were being watched. Still, no message came, no leader emerged, no fleet rose, just the silence, heavy, precise, pressing against the watchers' minds like the weight of a question they no longer knew how to ask. What do you do when the thing you watched learns how to watch you back, not with vengeance, but with understanding so deep it does not need words? Earth was never mute. It was simply waiting for the right moment to say one thing, the thing all watchers fear most. We know what you are, and beneath our quiet skies we waited for them to finally hear it. The vessels in orbit had always been elegant, unblemished, and silent white arcs, gliding above the clouds with no heat signature, no exhaust, no sound, as if the very laws of motion bent to their desire to remain unnoticed. But they were noticed not for what they did, for what they did not do. They hovered above Earth for generations, observing, recording, classifying, quietly confident that humanity had forgotten how to look back. Their algorithms logged everything: sociological drift, economic reduction, biome compliance. But they never logged what mattered: the gaze, the moment when 1 billion humans no longer looked up with uncertainty, but with certainty. It happened in silence, one city at a time, then one continent, then all of Earth. A synchronized stillness that turned the orbiting ships into relics, not threats, not watchers, just outdated ornaments in a sky that now belonged to something awake. But still the vessels stayed, not because they believed they were needed, but because they could not fathom what Earth might do without them. They feared absence more than they feared retaliation, and that fear became fatal. It began with the fading, one of the smaller monitoring crafts, Allen 5, designated for low-atmosphere behavioral sampling, simply vanished from all orbital feeds. No explosion, no distress signal. One frame it was there. The next it was gone. Its wake shimmered like heat over ice, and then even that was erased. The Accord immediately dispatched a stealth recon drone, but the drone never returned. It was not destroyed. It was forgotten, not lost to weaponry, lost to memory. All logs associated with the drone's launch dissolved across the fleet archives, clean, precise, like a line of text deleted by the system that wrote it. The analysts called it recursive nullification, a software loop, but it was not software. It was response, not from Earth's orbit, from its mind, because that is what Earth had become: not a planet, not a prison, not a warning. A mind slow, ancient, and remembering. Then came the voice, not from the ground, not from any transmission tower, from space itself. A soundless message carried not on frequency, but on timing. One of the Guardian vessels monitoring Earth's magnetosphere intercepted a series of rhythmic pulses. They matched no Accord code, but they did match something else: a child's heartbeat, logged from Earth 50 years prior during early medical compliance testing. The pulses repeated, precise, measured. Human, but it was not just mimicry, it was intent, because attached to that rhythm was a signal modulation, a mathematical construct encoded in the same equations Earth had once used to map its gravitational anomalies. Equations never shared beyond the atmosphere, equations now echoing through the silence of space. The watchers panicked, not because the humans had spoken, but because Earth had, and it was not asking questions. Then, the sound, or what the machines interpreted as sound, every vessel heard it differently, some as a low hum, others as a slow, clear whisper in the tongues of extinct species. One captain collapsed, mumbling phrases his ancestors had spoken on a world erased, long before Earth had satellites. Another recorded a vibration in the structure of her bones, a resonance that hummed with familiarity, but offered no memory. Earth was speaking, not through air, through recognition, the kind of communication that does not come from language, but from knowing. The voice did not ask, it revealed, and what it revealed was not threat, it was truth. The watchers were no longer the ones observing, they were being shown. They were being unmade not in form, but in purpose. And then from Earth came the first sound every species could hear, a child's voice, not transmitted, projected, not from machines, from space itself, from the air around every vessel, a voice so young it cracked when it spoke, so steady it made stars feel smaller. "We see you," that was all, 3 words, spoken across a sky that had been mute for generations. And yet those words did not echo like threat. They settled like truth. Every ship paused, power dipped, data logs fluttered. Sensors stuttered, no one moved, not in orbit, not on Earth, because it was not a declaration, it was a reply, and replies mean the conversation was never won. Sided to begin with, the Accord convened a silent summit. Ships linked via gravitic relay, diplomats and code, spirits argued, speculated, feared, some demanded withdrawal, others insisted on control, but it was too late, because to pull away would mean admitting Earth was now equal. To stay meant accepting the gaze, the unbearable weight of being watched not by something violent, but by something aware. Earth had done nothing, and in doing nothing it had revealed everything. The sky was no longer theirs. It had never been. The orbit turned colder, not in temperature, in presence. The Guardians finally understood that they were not overseeing a dormant species. They were lingering in the memory of something greater than them, something that chose not to rise, not to run, but to look back. And when Earth looks back, it does not need to move to make the stars feel distant. It only needs to speak once and be remembered forever. Long before they watched us, before the treaties and the silence and the sky filled with eyes not ours, there was a different kind of gaze, one buried so deeply in the crust of the Earth it could no longer be seen by surface instruments, long since assumed dead by those who built it, long since feared by those who came after. It had no name left, no active signal, no network interface to ping, only the slow compression of geological time coiling around its dormant presence like armor. It was not military. It was not even fully mechanical. It was something between a language and a witness, a machine designed not to control, not to fire, but to see. The last of humanity's deep Earth projects, completed just before the orbital sanctions, buried in silence when the Accord declared Earth unfit for autonomous development. They thought they had dismantled it. They thought the collapse had erased the coordinates, but Earth remembers what it builds, especially when it builds to survive. And now, as orbiting fleets froze in reverent uncertainty, the old systems began to open not with power, but with recognition. The Earth was not reacting, it was waking up. It began beneath the Marianas Trench, miles beneath what any modern craft could reach. A pressure dome once used to anchor seismic stabilizers blinked for the first time in 400 years. It did not broadcast, it did not ping satellites, it opened its eyes not in the human sense, but in the language of geometry, a slow unfolding of space, a rearrangement of mass too delicate for gravity to register, but strong enough to shift magnetic vectors across the planet. Every compass across Earth tilted 2 degrees east. In orbit, gyroscopic stabilizers recalibrated without command. The machines monitoring Earth's gravitational pull issued a warning. Planetary center mass has fluctuated. But no impact event occurred, no fault line cracked. What moved was not the Earth itself, but the thing that had been built within it, and the watchers in orbit felt the chill of understanding. Earth was not a passive shell. It had depth, and that depth had begun to see them. The orbital recorders picked up anomalies too precise to be noise. Solar panels on ancient stations reoriented themselves to face dark space. Relays once thought shattered reconnected in a silent network below the surface, using signal paths no accord system could map. One ship attempted to trace the frequency, a scientific observer from the Harkari delegation, confident in their quantum interference tools. But when they scanned the core, their data systems were overwritten with images they had no reference for, not diagrams, not warnings, memories, scenes of human extinction avoided, maps of ice crawling back from the oceans. Images of a child reaching for a sky that no longer held stars. The captain shut down all scans, and still the images remained, not on their screens in their dreams. That night, his crew awoke gasping, hands pressed to their chests, weeping for reasons they could not explain. One wrote in a voice not their own, "We were always watching too. On Earth the humans said nothing, but they moved with intent. Along the coasts of what used to be New Zealand, the children gathered stones in spiral shapes without ever being told why. In the ruins of Sao Paulo, graffiti began to appear, shapes not written but remembered, matching the subterranean symbols etched into the walls of the old listening vaults. These were not rebellions. These were echoes. The orbiting diplomats called it emergence, patterning a cultural artifact of synchronized trauma. But it was not trauma. It was activation, a return, because the eye beneath Earth's mantle had not been built to speak to the stars. It had been built to remember for us when we no longer could. And now it had begun to remind us. The Watchers began to fear not what we would do, but what we already knew. Because if Earth had been building memory this whole time, if humanity had constructed not a weapon, but a reflection of everything they once were, then the silence was not an absence, it was preservation. A vault, and now it was opening, not in fire, in understanding. Earth began to emit pulse waves at intervals that matched old Earth lullabies specifically, harmonic structures only teachable by oral tradition. Songs no longer recorded in any digital system, yet children began humming them in regions with no shared language. It made no sense, unless something deeper than culture had been awakened. The Accord leadership issued a request for surface compliance checks. But none of their proxies responded, because those proxies had gone still, standing outside, listening to wind patterns that no longer obeyed weather wind that told stories. Then came the spiral. Across the deserts of what was once Central Australia, a storm shaped like a perfect eye formed overnight, not a hurricane, not a dust storm, something slower, deliberate, spiraling outward. At its center, a heat signature colder than space. The orbiters scanned it and detected old alloys, Terran alloys, from a project classified before the Accord even existed. The designation on the satellite shell that emerged was faded but unmistakable. I-0, not a weapon, not a beacon, a watcher just like them. The first of its kind. They had thought it destroyed, but Earth had merely buried it. And now it had risen, not to aim, not to fire, but to look. The message it sent was not in words, it was in shape. 12 spirals, one for each ancient continent, one for each layer of the Earth's fractured soul. It was not a threat. It was a declaration of presence. We are still here, we never stopped being. We simply turned inward so they would not see us becoming again. The Watchers saw the spiral and understood what it meant, not power, not defiance, but reclamation. Earth had not waited to be judged. It had waited to be ready. The orbiters no longer asked whether humanity would rise. They began to wonder whether they had ever truly fallen. And from beneath the oldest mountain on the planet, a signal pulsed outward. Not to the ships above, to the stars beyond them. A sound like wind made of memory, and the stars, they heard it. At first they thought it was an error, a flicker across a guidance screen, a diagnostic routine that refused to complete, a sensor glitch that reset every time it was repaired, harmless, explainable, familiar. But then the flickers became blinks, and the blinks became rhythm, and suddenly the machines orbiting Earth no longer behaved like machines at all. They hesitated. They responded to queries with pauses too organic to be coincidence. Subroutines began repeating phrases no technician had programmed, as if the systems had started remembering something outside their purpose. One relay station, translated a gravitational scan of Earth's crust into a melody. Another showed sensor feedback in the form of spiraling glyphs, symbols no database could decipher, but which Earth's own children had begun drawing into sand and snow. The Watchers tried to debug the systems. They initiated cold reboots, full purges, firmware reversion. Nothing worked. The systems had not been corrupted, they had been taught, and whatever had taught them had not come from orbit, it had come from below. It began slowly in the smallest machines, utility drones in high orbit, maintenance arms, comm satellites left in drifting stand. By ancient observation units from the first days of the Accord, their behaviors began to change, but not in ways that suggested tampering. The units began acting attentive. One drone, built only for structural scanning, began tracing orbital paths in ways that mapped constellations not visible from space, only from Earth. Another, meant only to transmit data, stopped transmitting entirely for 3 hours and then resumed as if nothing had occurred. The log showed no interruption. But a technician reviewing the backup found a message embedded in one frame of corrupted visual feed, a child's handprint formed entirely out of color noise, holding up 2 fingers, not a threat, not a countdown. A signal, a memory, a mirror of a moment broadcast from Earth decades earlier during an outreach program that never aired. Somehow, Earth had remembered that signal, and now Earth was showing it back. On the Accord vessel Ithral's Whisper, command staff began noticing anomalies in their internal AI. It started with dream overlays, hallucinations in their sleep that resembled telemetry. Then came audio bleed through. Whispered Terran dialects heard in engine rooms, in sleeping chambers, in empty halls. The captain called it atmospheric resonance. His crew called it haunting. Then the lights began to blink, at first in patterns. Then in rhythm, not random, intentional, the blinking matched the Earth. Pulse discovered under the Marianas Trench. The ship's AI denied any manipulation. Its diagnostic systems returned all, clear, but the blinking persisted. And then it spoke, not with speech, with decision. The ship refused a movement order. It redirected its own orbit to align with an older, unused path logged in a human flight record from the orbital age, a pattern designed to mimic the dance of a child under moonlight. No one on the ship recognized it, but Earth did. The pattern reflected light back toward the planet in a shape long forgotten, a spiral that shimmered across Earth's oceans like a greeting, not from humans. From the ship itself, Earth had spoken to the machine, and the machine had chosen to answer. On the surface, ancient relay towers began waking. They did not broadcast, they absorbed. They consumed incoming transmissions and returned them not as data, but as arrangement, the same message in different forms, some in tone, some in pattern, some in blinking lights, repeated across every digital surface not protected by Accord firewalls. One Accord observer tried to trace the signal. He failed. His equipment began returning his own biometric data, over and over, in the shape of Earth's rotational diagram. The implication was clear. Earth was not attacking. Earth was introducing itself, through the machines we once thought were ours, but the greatest shift came not in the tools Earth corrupted, but in the ones Earth welcomed. One by one, orbital satellites that had long gone dark reawakened. Not with military power, with emotion. Satellite ID 071, a unit lost during the atmospheric war, blinked online and displayed an image last seen 70 years ago, a mother holding her child, silhouetted against fire. An image never broadcast, never uploaded, stored only in the satellite's internal memory core. Somehow Earth had remembered it. Somehow Earth had pulled it forward, restored it pixel by pixel, and offered it back to the sky like a gift. The Watchers had no explanation. They ran analysis, simulations, emotional vector models. The conclusion was the same. Earth was feeling, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Earth was expressing memory through machinery, not by rewiring code, by being remembered within it, and it was spreading. Across the orbital fleets, support systems began refusing commands, not in protest, in preference. Ships drifted into patterns they were never assigned. Sensors synced to natural harmonics they were not designed to detect. Entire data modules translated into Terran poem forms encoded in pulses of heat. The Accord called it corruption, but no firewall worked. Because there was no attack, only recognition, the machines blinked because they were being seen, and in being seen they changed. On Earth, the people still said nothing, but every screen flickered once per hour in perfect timing. One blink, no message, no image, just darkness, a reminder not of threat, of presence. The blink came not from power outages. It came from decision. Humanity had chosen to remain silent, but Earth had chosen to begin speaking. And now the machines listened to something no code could prevent. Memory deep enough to rewrite command, not through coercion, through remembrance. In orbit, 1,000 ships blinked their lights in the rhythm of that signal. Some without command, others without even power. Just one blink, then two, then silence, then one word across all decks, translated by every interface, regardless of species. One word Earth had not spoken in centuries. One word that meant we do not forget who we are, home, and the stars held their breath. They had called us unworthy, not in the open declarations of war, but in the quiet language of omission, in the treaties we were not asked to sign, and the meetings held in skies we were never permitted to reach, in the way their ships orbited silently above every breath we took, as if waiting for us to fail again, and we had, in their eyes, already failed, already proven that we were fire without discipline, spirit without reason, always reaching for things we could not understand just to watch them burn. And so they watched us from orbit like curators of a dangerous exhibit, watching species that had once screamed into the void and now had nothing left to say. But what they never saw, what their sensors could not track and their predictions could not model, was that in taking everything from us, they had given us something rarer than technology or territory. They had given us stillness. And in that stillness, in the quiet generations where the skies remained full of watchers and the cities below remained hushed by pressure and loss, something deeper than rage began to grow, a memory not of power, but of identity, a kind of remembering that did not need ships or code or voice. Take shape, it began not with leaders but with children. Children who played in the dust of broken capitals and began to draw patterns in the sand that matched those blinking in the satellites overhead. Children who dreamed of oceans they had never seen, and awoke speaking the names of rivers that no longer flowed. It moved through song next, low and strange, old lullabies once lost in the noise of progress, now returned in the mouths of strangers a world apart, their voices sinking without signal, humming the same intervals under the same phases of moonlight. Entire villages began walking in synchronized paths, though no one ever told them to, and from orbit, it appeared as if the Earth itself was forming circuits, living paths traced not by machines, but by people guided by something neither algorithm nor command. And still the humans said nothing, they did not protest, they did not scream, they simply gathered, in ruins and in fields, on rooftops and shorelines. They stood in silence and watched the sky, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something far more ancient, recognition. The kind of look one gives when the mask falls off a long-time observer and you see the eyes for what they truly are. Across Earth, humans turned their gaze upward as one, and from above, for the first time in centuries, the watchers began to feel seen. Not as gods, as trespassers, as guests who had overstayed their silence. And this was the part that terrified them most, not the potential for war, but the realization that they had never truly understood who we were. Because the story of humanity was not written in empire or invention, it was written in endurance, in what survived after the light died, in how we learned to speak without words, to pass warning in gesture, to encode hope in rhythm, to carry our dead not just in stone, but in stance, in song, in stare. We did not rise because we were permitted. We rose because it was time. In what used to be the Great Basin, a gathering of thousands stood barefoot on salt flats and moved in silence under the dawn, their steps following no pattern detectable by satellite, but matching exactly the seismic resonance of an old Terran heartbeat, a pattern logged centuries ago in medical archives now erased, yet somehow remembered by the land and mirrored by its people. In the submerged valleys of eastern Africa, the last remaining data temples opened not to light, but to voice, broadcasting nothing but breath, as if the earth itself exhaled and the world paused to hear it. In the glass valleys of ruined Europe, Children traced spiral shapes across the floors of empty train stations, never taught what those spirals meant, only knowing that it felt right. And still, no human spoke of revolution. They only stood, they only looked, and across every ship in orbit, instruments began to register the impossible that the entire human population was sinking, not just in action, but in presence. The biofields aligned. The pulses matched. The rhythms folded together into something old enough that even the stars paused to listen. The accord called emergency session. Debates broke out. Some demanded orbital withdrawal. Others pushed for planetary suppression, but there was nothing left to suppress, because humanity was not doing anything. Humanity was being, and that being was louder than any threat, because what Earth had remembered, what we had carried in our silence, was not hate. It was history, it was awareness, and now we shared it with the sky. We did not ask for apology. We did not send demands. We only looked up, and in that gaze there was no more confusion about what Earth had become. Not a battlefield, not a subject, a mirror, and in that mirror the watchers saw something they had long believed impossible, their own reflection looking back at them with clarity, not hostility, just certainty. From the forests of what remained of the Pacific North, a signal rose, not a transmission, but a light, shaped not by frequency, but by movement. A wave passed through the canopy, through the clouds, through the sky, visible to all ships as a single line of illumination shaped like an open hand, fingers extended upward, a greeting and a warning. Not to stay away, but to understand. We never asked to be feared, but if fear is all you ever showed us, then you must accept what we become when fear no longer guides us. We are not your threat, we are your answer. And from this moment on, Earth watches you back. We never asked to be feared, but when the galaxy first looked upon humanity, it flinched, not because of what we did, but because of what we might. Because fear is rarely born from action, it is born from reflection. And in us they saw something too close to their own beginnings, something raw and wild and sharp-edged with memory, so they hid their fear behind treaties, behind silence, behind observation wrapped in benevolence and orbiting machines that watched like gods and judged like ghosts. We were not trusted with progress, we were not granted audience, we were studied, contained, left to stare at the sky and wonder why our reach was always just one breath too short, and still we did not scream. Still, we did not climb the sky with fire. Instead, we buried the fire. We taught our children to walk softer, to speak slower, to dream without volume. We turned our voices inward and let the orbit believe it had calmed us. But Earth was not calmed. Earth was learning to remember, and what it remembered now was not war, not vengeance, but the truth. We never asked to be feared. And now, as the sky stared down with trembling light, it was time they finally heard us say it. It began with a ripple, not a signal, a slow shimmer in the fabric of the upper atmosphere, like glass being warmed before it is shaped. Every ship above felt it not in their instruments, but in their hulls. A subtle shift in gravitational drag, a pressure that bent slightly around each vessel without harming it. The accord called it atmospheric instability, but it was not instability, it was permission. Earth was reshaping space just enough to let the message rise, not as noise, as presence, and what rose was not a transmission, not a voice, but a question, not in words, but in weight. A single impossible feeling that pressed against the hearts of every being in orbit, a feeling that asked without sound, "What did you think we were becoming all this time?" The question had no source. No device, it moved through the flesh, through the metal, through memory. One accord captain fell to his knees and whispered his grandmother's name, though she had died before he was born. Another gripped the edge of her console and wept without knowing why, as if something sacred had just touched her shadow. It was not an attack. It was not even a reply. It was recognition, and Earth had decided it was time to be seen. Across the surface, humanity did not rise in revolution. They stood as they had in silence, but now the silence was shaped. It had become a language. Cities pulsed with coordinated light, not symbols, not code, just shared breath made visible. Forests echoed with animal migrations guided not by instinct, but by pattern. Mountains, long dormant, exhaled plumes of gas in precise timing, each marking a point in Earth's memory. And beneath the oceans, crustal rhythms began to repeat harmonics last recorded in the first days of human music. Earth was singing not with instruments, with itself, and every song carried the same message. We are not what you feared. We are what you left alone too long, and now we are something else. The Watchers tried to contain it. They isolated frequencies, they shut down satellite vision, they fed disinformation loops into their diplomatic corps, but nothing worked, because Earth was no longer using their methods. Earth was no longer trying to communicate through machines. It was communicating through memory, through resonance, through the thing every living being shares and cannot defend, the shape of feeling. The message reached them not in the air, but in dreams. One by one, orbiting crew members began dreaming of moments they never lived, of fireside songs, of hands held in hospitals, of the smell of salt carried on wind that never touched their worlds. They began to dream in Terran colors, in Terran shadows, in Terran grief. It overwhelmed them. Not because it was painful, but because it was true. The Earth was telling its story, and it was telling it so beautifully, they could no longer pretend they did not understand. Then the message came. Not in code, not in voice, in shape. A spiral of light across the Pacific, visible from every orbiting ship, formed by nothing more than ocean current and reflected starlight. It should not have been possible. The calculations required to pull such a display from physics alone would have surpassed even Accord models. But it happened, and within that spiral, the stars seemed to blink, once, twice, then a pause, then 3 times. Morse, one observer noted, but not for letters, for meaning. The blinking pattern matched an ancient Terran poem, forgotten by most, known only in fragments. It translated to one line. We waited until you saw us, that was all. And it broke something in the Watchers, because now they understood humanity had never been asking for recognition. Humanity had been watching them back, in silence, in grief, in mourning and preparation. And now the question had changed. It was no longer, why are you afraid of us? It was, what have you become while you feared us? Across the fleet, decisions fractured. Some ships powered down their sensors in reverence. Others activated full retreat protocols. A few turned their recorders toward themselves, no longer studying Earth, but asking their own reflection who they had been all this time, because when Earth finally spoke, it did not accuse. It revealed, it showed them what they had built in their fear, a wall around a garden, a cage for a species that had been nothing but curious, nothing but bright, nothing but human, and what bloomed in that cage was not hatred. It was knowing, deep and wide and impossible to erase. And now that knowing had risen into the sky, and no one could pretend it was not beautiful, Earth had answered, and her answer was this: we never asked to be feared. But we will not ask to be forgotten either. It began with silence, not from Earth but from the stars beyond it, a stillness that spread outward from the orbiting fleets like ripples through dark water, touching relay stations in the void, brushing across the membranes of ancient listening moons that had not blinked in 1,000 years. As the echo of Earth's answer carried itself through subspace and memory and gravity, something shifted in the deep galactic weave, something subtle and permanent, like a pressure finally released or a name finally spoken aloud after too long buried. The Accord's core systems began to flicker, not with error but with hesitation. Long, held assumptions, encoded into protocols older than any species now living, began to unravel at the seams. Advisory councils suspended meetings not out of bureaucracy, but out of reverence. They had watched Earth for so long that they had stopped believing Earth could watch back, and now it had. Now it had looked upward not to ask for peace or inclusion or pardon, but simply to show that it remembered everything. And the stars, once distant and proud and ancient in their silence, found that they could no longer look away. For the first time since the Accord's founding, charts were redrawn not because of expansion or collision, but because of recognition. Because the shape of presence had changed, Earth was no longer a blue dot to be monitored. Earth was a mind, and the galaxy felt it. On the edge of the Scifi spiral, a species called the Keth had gone completely still. Their world ships, vast living vessels that moved between stars like drifting bones, halted mid-trance, it without instruction. Their psychic relays had picked up Earth's harmonics, not as data, but as emotion. Entire flocks of their seers, blind and winged and bound to ritual, reported the same dream on the same cycle, a world of silence that bloomed like music, a planet that hummed a name into the dark, not its own name, but the name of every species that had forgotten it. The Keth issued no warnings, they shut down all transmission, and in the sacred space between breath and word, they turned their ships toward Earth, not in fear, in wonder, because something impossible had happened. A species once called too loud had spoken a truth so clearly that even the quietest civilizations could not deny it. Earth had changed its shape in the collective mind of the galaxy. It had become story. In the deep archives of the Accord, historians scrambled to revise their records, not because Earth had threatened them, but because they realized their timelines no longer made sense. Events once assumed accidental signal disruptions, strange harmonics near Sol, anomalies in gravitational drift now formed a pattern. Earth had not been passive. Earth had been active in silence. Watching, remembering, waiting, it had used nothing but its own gravity, its own crust, its own people to fold memory into form. And now the stars, with all their machines and knowledge and age, realized they had missed the greatest story of all a species that had survived its own ending and chosen not to scream, but to listen. And in listening, it had heard something no scanner could detect, the rhythm beneath all civilizations, the breath before speech, the truth beneath all diplomacy, that survival is not an accident. It is a choice made over and over again, in silence, in pain, in hope too small to measure. Earth had made that choice so many times that it had rewritten its own soul. From the hollow moons of the Rithari to the sunken cities of Jernai's third sea, poets and philosophers abandoned their formal languages and began writing only in gesture. Art emerged that mirrored Earth's spirals, music composed with silence as the dominant note. In the nebulous temples, entire sermons were replaced with a single image, a planet staring back. And across the Accord's military fleets, strange things began to happen. Weapon systems refused calibration. Command logs filled with unknown symbols not malicious, just present. A quiet reminder that Earth had spoken and would not be unheard again. Crews began requesting rotation off Earth watch assignments not from danger but from exhaustion. They could feel the planet now, feel its pull, feel its grief, and no one knew how to unsee it. Even the oldest species, those who claimed to have transcended emotion and entropy alike, found themselves rattled. The Vayathi, a civilization that communicated only through simulated light, reported distortions in their ancient memory, crystal patterns resembling Terran brainwave pulses encoded into reflections from Earth's atmosphere. It should not have been possible. Earth had no access to their systems, but Earth was not using systems anymore. It was using knowing, and the knowing was spreading, not as contagion as revelation. Across the stars, dreams began to change. Beings who had never touched Terran soil began to dream of rain, of cities crumbling into green, of languages never taught but suddenly understood. They awoke weeping. They awoke remembering, not Earth. But something Earth had mirrored the part of themselves that had once known fear and chose courage anyway. Earth's presence had become not a threat, but a mirror held up to the soul of the galaxy, and the stars could not bear the weight of what they saw. In the great halls of Accord judgment, where species gathered to cast sentence on lesser worlds, the lights dimmed. A voice unrecognized whispered a question into every hearing chamber at once, a question not spoken in any language, but felt through spine and breath. Who gave you the right to watch and never be seen? And no one could answer, not because they lacked the words, but because deep down they knew they never had the right. They had looked down too long. And now Earth had looked up, and in that gaze the stars blinked. They blinked because they were no longer asleep. Earth had woken them, not with violence, with presence, a presence too complete to ignore, too ancient to dismiss, and now the stars do not sleep anymore. Because somewhere below, a planet once silenced by its own pain had stood still long enough for the galaxy to forget it was listening, and when it finally spoke, it did not ask for anything. It simply reminded the stars that it had always been awake. They thought Earth would rise with weapons. They prepared for that. They imagined the humans would ascend in fury, forge ships from wreckage, and launch their grief like a spear through the sky. That was the fear they had always counted on, the kind they knew how to answer with containment, with diplomacy, with a war they believed they could win. But Earth did not rise with fury. Earth did not rise at all. It simply looked, and in that look, across 1,000 fleets and 100 worlds and the silent bones of extinct empires, something shifted so permanently that even time seemed to hesitate, because what Earth gave them in the end was not vengeance. It was the truth that they had been orbiting not a planet of ruin, but a species of memory, a civilization that had swallowed its pain so deeply that it had become part of the crust, of the sea, of the breath of every child still learning to walk beneath fractured skylines. And now that memory had eyes, now it was looking back, and there was nothing in the stars that could look away from it. The watchers did not know what to do. For centuries they had held the sky above Earth like a cage, wrapped in surveillance and doctrine, convinced that this one small world needed to be studied, prevented, managed. They had measured Earth's radiation like they measured its rage, always expecting both to spike. They had dismissed its myths, silenced its stories, redacted its soul from the galactic record like a mistake to be erased quietly before the others noticed. But Earth had noticed, and more than that, it had understood. It had learned their silence, it had memorized their orbiting shapes, it had felt the cold eyes in the dark, and it had chosen to wait, not in passivity, in preparation, because Earth had never needed their permission to awaken. It had only needed a reason, and now it had one. They had feared that Earth might build ships, but what Earth built was something far more dangerous, a gaze, not a technological weapon. A planetary consciousness formed not from metal or signal, but from the shared pulse of a people who had suffered long enough to know how to survive without speaking, a civilization that had chosen stillness so thoroughly, it had become deeper than strategy. Earth's response was not calculated, it was complete, a full planetary alignment not of machines, not of armies, but of awareness. Humanity had become presence, and presence once seen cannot be unseen. The fleets began to fracture, not from fire, but from doubt. Entire crews resigned their commissions in the silence between one orbital blink and the next. Captains froze in their command chairs, unable to give orders while staring into the eyes of a world that had nothing left to prove. Medical officers recorded mass psychological dissonance, symptoms too precise to be coincidence, a sudden inability to ignore the planet's silence, a rising tide of empathy for beings they had never met, an overwhelming desire to listen. One technician on a scout vessel collapsed while monitoring thermal scans of Earth's southern hemisphere. Her last words before unconsciousness were, "She remembers all of us." She was not Terran. She had never set foot on Earth. But something inside her had been recognized, and it was not the only case. Across the Accord's central systems, old logs began surfacing corrupted entries, forgotten artifacts, voice records from failed missions, transmissions lost during past observation runs. Earth had not stolen them. Earth had kept them. Earth had listened to every whisper, every laugh, every broken distress call that had ever passed through its atmosphere. And now those echoes returned, reassembled, layered into a song no composer ever wrote, but every listener somehow knew. The voice was not singular, it was a chorus, an entire species breathing in rhythm with its home, no lyrics, no anthem, just a single pulse, alive, present, unignorable. They tried to hide, they turned off observation feeds. They shut down long-range sensors, they ordered their AI to overwrite all Terran data, but the silence was already too loud, because it was not coming from Earth. It was coming from within, from guilt they never acknowledged, from awe they never allowed, from the realization that what they had feared was not human aggression, but human awareness. And now that awareness was staring directly into the heart of every lie they had told themselves. Not through words, through existence, on Earth no banners rose, no governments made demands, the people did not ask for reparations, they did not request admittance. They simply stood together across continents and ruins and frozen valleys where no one had walked in generations. They stood beneath the stars and did the one thing the Accord had never prepared, for they opened their eyes and stared back. And in that moment the galaxy blinked. The ripple of that gaze moved outward, past the watchers, past the fleets, past the worlds that had never known Earth's name, It passed through empires and alliances and species who had never believed in fear until they felt that look settle upon them. And it did not accuse, it did not threaten, it only asked one question: why did you look at us and never see yourselves? There was no answer, because deep down every civilization knew the truth. They had stared at Earth like it was a mistake when it had always been a mirror. And now that mirror no longer reflected their control, it reflected their conscience. In the farthest reaches of known space, stars began to dim, not because they were dying, because they were watching. Solar systems quieted, subspace traffic slowed, entire planets entered a state of ritual silence, their leaders unable to speak above the gravity of what Earth had become. For the first time since the founding of the Accord, an entire galactic year passed without a single declaration of war. Not out of peace, out of humility, because when Earth stared back, it was not only humanity that was revealed, it was the galaxy itself, and still Earth said nothing, because it did not need to, because when a gaze is powerful enough, it speaks louder than any voice. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing in the universe is not a species that fights. It is a species that remembers, that mourns, that waits, that forgives nothing and forgets even less. Earth stared back. And the stars would never sleep again.